Hello there, viewers, and welcome to Cartoon Gateway. I'm your host, David Hollander. Here's a little known fact about me. I am allowed to tell people that I am affiliated with the Walt Disney Corporation. I'd be lying if I told anyone that, but technically nothing is stopping me from lying in a non-court setting. I'm doing another one, by which I mean an episode of Cartoon Gateway all about a single show. That's right, Futurama and Bob the Builder have a new cohort in their exclusive club. We can only guess what the next one will be. Can you guess what the next one is? If you can't, I question how, considering we have title cards. Please disregard if you are blind or cannot read the title card. You actually have an excuse. Ducktales, asterisk, which is to say, Ducktales, the new one. Newer one, at least. The 2017 reboot of the original 90s series. Oh wait, sorry, 80s series. If SpongeBob was a 90s show, classic Ducktales is an 80s show. Hope that early onset arthritis isn't too unmanageable. 90s kids know and I'm just messing with them. Besides, it doesn't matter what you think of my jokes anyway. The fact is that as long as I live, I'll always be 6 feet taller than the average 90s kid. So I'm fine. Back in 1987, the original DuckTales premiered. The story of Donald Duck's 3 nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, going on adventures with their uncle Scrooge McDuck, the richest duck in the world. They go on globe-trotting adventures, hunting treasures, and facing off against bad guys like the evil Magica de Spale, Flintheart Glomgold, and the Beagle Boys gang. Ran for 100 episodes, 4 seasons, while also being pretty much the first major cartoon of the 80s to be successful without having a toy line to promote. Executives were really beating that drum in the mid to late 80s, but it turns out you didn't need toys to be successful as long as the show was good. I admit I never watched the classic show, at least not substantially. I knew of it by reputation, of course, from references and that theme song. The closest I ever came to the old show was playing through most of the remastered DuckTales video game on the Wii U at Anime Boston one year. But then came 2017, when Disney announced they were rebooting the show, and hand me a bill and call me Donald because the 2017 version I did watch, and it was quite good. Yes, I am giving the series its own episode. The reboot of the Disney Afternoon Classic is legitimately some of the best television that Disney Channel ever produced, and it's not talked about nearly as much as you'd think. Gravity Falls, tons of video essays, a thriving online culture. Phineas and Ferb, absolutely agreed upon to be a classic. The Owl House, Amphibia, apparently those were amazing. I've yet to find evidence to the contrary because I still haven't had time to watch either, I'm sorry. DuckTales 2017, a show absolutely on the level of those. No one really talks about it. You can't even say it was because it was overshadowed. Amphibia only started airing after DuckTales had a season and a half in the bag, and the Owl House was newer than that. Both Phineas Ferbs and Gravity and Fall were long done by the time DuckTales started. This show ruled the roost and did so expertly. Why don't more people talk about it when Best Disney Channel cartoon comes up? So I figured I should do some justice to what is among my top 4 favorite cartoons ever. That's right, longtime viewers. Remember my Trinity? It's got a 4th now. I want to make clear that I have strict criteria for a cartoon to be a favorite of mine. Usually that it has to make me feel something, that I have to have seen the whole thing, and I feel compelled to rewatch it or binge it occasionally. That explains why certain shows I love aren't in this group here. American Dad makes me laugh. I've watched it front to back and still watch it, but it's not exactly the most emotional show. Family Guy. Okay, I know I've insulted Family Guy a lot, but I want it on the record that that's mostly theater when I dunk on it for jokes. Like, a chunk of Family Guy is genuinely what I'd consider the best television you can watch, meaning only a fraction of that show reaches that height, and by nature, the longer it goes on, the smaller that fraction becomes. That's not me being mean, that's just math. Phineas and Ferb, The Amazing World of Gumball. Love them, made me laugh, never felt compelled to fully rewatch either of them. Justice League Unlimited, masterfully intelligent, but again, never felt the need to go back and watch the whole thing. Penn Zero Part-Time Hero. Yeah, underrated, but with a few too many easily diagnosable problems. Usually a favorite show of mine is harder to have nitpicks with. Regular Show, again, too easy to nitpick aspects of it. Bob the Builder, even if I counted it, I've already done an episode on it. Mau Mau, Heroes of Pure Heart. There's simply not enough. I can see an absolute favorite show in here. Shame it got cut off when it did. Over the Garden Wall, art with a capital E for existential dread, let down a bit by being so much of a seasonal thing, so I feel like I'm committing a crime by watching it anytime other than fall. Pokemon! Binging Pokemon all the way through isn't relaxing, it's a cry for help. I'm strict about this. And I don't want shows too similar to ones I already consider favorites also among my favorites. Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, for instance. If I included a second show based on a Marvel comic which only got 2 seasons when there were plans for more that were upended for stupid reasons, that just wouldn't be fair on everything else. Ninjago is probably the closest to being a favorite without actually being a top 5 one, if only because the quality changes so much from season to season. Plus it's had many subtitles and format changes, and I can't put a whole franchise in there. But I do love Ninjago as a franchise. If I were less restrained, I'd release a detailed ranking of the first 15 seasons of the show before Dragons Rising, even though I've already said which season is my favorite, which would make the whole ranking ranking pointless. Would anyone watch that? Let me know. TLDR, love it, but it fluctuates in quality a bit too much to be up there, you know? Either way, the worst season of Ninjago was just an average to above average action show, and the best seasons are downright electrifying. Teen Titans. That's probably worth counting as a favorite, but I can't in good conscience put it there. My initial viewing of that show was insanely out of order because it was based on what DVDs I could find at my local Barnes & Noble. So I started on season 2 and straight up never saw season 4 all the way through because they never had that DVD there when I had my wallet. So to be blunt, I'm a little picky when distinguishing cartoons I like from absolute favorites. Being said, 2017's Ducktales previously wasn't counted among my absolute favorites, and literally the only reason was because I hadn't seen it from the back at the time, and now I have. I watched it back when it aired, but stopped about halfway through the 3rd season. Nothing made me stop watching it. Interest didn't dwindle. I just have this nasty habit where if I love a show enough, I'll stop watching it just so it doesn't feel like an edit in my brain. Yeah, I know, childish habit, but I recently buckled down and finished it. And I was absolutely wrong for not sticking with the show as it aired. I didn't even care that it was over. Life was sad now. It was just that good. I didn't care. So I figure I should talk about it because there is a lot to say. Besides, DuckTales holds the distinction of being the only show on Cartoon Gateway I've talked about, which I have actually met someone who has worked on it. Character designer Alex Kerwin, my singular professional connection. I've probably mentioned another show he's worked on in a previous episode, but this has been the best spot to mention him. Really nice guy, but I'm not gonna dwell on my humble bragging. I wanna talk about DuckTales. Woohoo! I suppose we should start by talking about what DuckTales was up against, because I need you to realize how much of an uphill battle this was. Picture this. You are a kid who grew up in the 2000s. You were a fan of this little show called Teen Titans. Yeah, maybe not your favorite show, you caught glimpses of it, but really close to your heart. Cartoon Network then makes this new show called Teen Titans Go. Reboots don't have the best reputation, but it's only 2013 and there have been a few good reboots you can think of. And the bad ones aren't too egregious. Sure, it's a comedy show, but it's a return to the characters, right? Maybe you can live with that. So you smile through the pain watching it, and the show starts actively insulting the original show and people who like it, and it's all that CN airs. So you decide you can't deal with it. Then Cartoon Network decides to make another reboot 3 years later. Powerpuff Girls this time. Maybe TTG was a fluke. Except everything leading up to this show's release is a PR nightmare. You hear constant behind the scenes drama, all in service to a show that doesn't even hold a candle to the original you've watched on Boomerang all this time. Then there's a Ben 10 reboot, and you can't even see that one because everyone else is already dogpiling it. You just saw 3 reboots get released within a few years of each other. Each one gets critically panned. And then Disney rocks up saying they're going to make a reboot of the beloved DuckTales, and you, who now has it in your brain that reboots are inherently bad because of the last few years, are horrified. No thanks, Disney. Get away from that baby. It hasn't known sin. I don't like people who immediately reject things that are new just because they're new, but I don't blame anyone for being a little shell-shocked when this thing was announced. Before we get into the show, let's start with figuring out why most reboots usually fail. I know I've called Futurama the king of reboots or the king of coming back, but by the definition of reboot that I laid out in the episode where I talked about Futurama, I'd say DuckTales would absolutely take the cake in that regard. It is, by that measure, the best reboot I think I've seen. And the biggest reason most reboots fail, I'd say, is the expectations of fans. Why would fans expect a reboot of a show they loved to fail? They may be emotional children, but they're children that have been hurt before, okay? And it didn't help that cartoon reboots around this time were mostly cut from the same cloth. Take a show, make it a comedy with an 11-minute runtime, no matter how appropriate. Make sure the characters superficially resemble classic counterparts, but put no effort in where the nuts and bolts are concerned so they can work as less nuanced comedic characters. And every time you reference the original work, make sure it sounds as dismissive and too cool to be sincere as possible. Literally one step away from insulting it. There have been so many bad reboots, especially around the time DuckTales was released, that the immediate expectation is that they're going to be bad and fail. And that is a hard trap to get out of. Even good reboots fall into this. When Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles first showed those character designs, people went nuts because it looked like another reboot of this style. So they didn't bother to see the show in motion and never made the connection that the show was as good as it was. A similar story with the Ben 10 reboot. This show was treated way too harshly. Yeah, I'd never say it's as good as the original series, but I think some of you guys are just looking for an excuse to vent. Heck, the show didn't air in the US for a whole year after its international premiere. So we have a show that was hated by American audiences before they even got to see the thing properly. And in practice, a lot of issues with the Ben 10 reboot could be explained away with even the slightest rational thought. It's for a younger demographic and has shorter episode runtime, so of course the tone and art style would lean more into comedy. Of course the character designs would be simplified as an effect of this. That's why some of the redesigns were so drastic, by the way. It was to make them easier to animate. As an 11-minute comedy with action elements, it wasn't that bad, but because the expectation was that it was just another insulting reboot of the style, nobody gave it a chance. I still think that's unfair because I'd argue there was a small number of things that it did better than the original series. Ben didn't become the most overpowered character in fiction because they actually kept him limited to just 10 aliens at a time. I like a lot of the voice work. You know what? Time and place, time and place. This is about DuckTales. You get my point. One last Ben 10 truth. Water Hazard has always been awful and Overflow is the better alien by leagues. All right, now we can move on. So between all of its contemporaries giving the concept of reboot a bad rap, one can imagine that DuckTales was fighting an uphill battle with one leg. So what did the show do differently? For one, it spews reverence for the original series out of every pore. Several of the voice actors are well-documented fans of this stuff. I mean, everyone loves the original DuckTales theme, and the new one is literally the original theme in a different key and with new instrumentals. It slaps, they knew what to do. Secondly, our first exposure. Rise of the TMNT, great as it is, just revealed the character designs and kept us in suspense for half a year, letting people stew in their own hateful juices. And people taste terrible when they've stewed in their juices. DuckTales, meanwhile, supplemented the reveal with several shorts showcasing the characters in the new style with new voices and whatnot. A first impression means little if it doesn't reflect what the show is like. And the best way to do that, things that might as well be snippets from the show. Which brings me to the big point, advertising. If there's one thing Disney does that Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network don't, it's advertising their new shows. I know, commercialization, blah, but it was to the show's benefit to have marketing on its side. I'm gonna go more on that in a minute, but yeah, the show made a great first impression, and then the premiere movie was released both on Disney Channel and on YouTube. They made it easy to find the actual show rather than letting clips creep into people's recommendations 7 months down the line. I'm gonna give y'all a brief rundown on those 3 seasons just to get you guys up to speed. I'm gonna try to avoid major spoilers, but I mean, this show has been over for years. Nevertheless, I will try. Our first season, Donald brings Huey, Dewey, and Louie to their rich Uncle Scrooge, and after our inaugural adventure, the family is back together. Also at McDuck Manor is Ms. Beakley, who doubles as housekeeper and assistant. Ms. Beakley's granddaughter, Webby, an aspiring adventurer and practicing misanthrope obsessed with the McDuck family. And Launchpad McQuack, he's a pilot. Everyone's been reasonably updated from their classic counterparts. Launchpad's still goofy, just in a different way. Scrooge is a little bit more of a bitter loner, like in some of the old comic books the show pulls from. And Donald is always Donald. There are some notable differences though. With Duckworth gone, Beakley fills his role of housekeeper, which fits. A maid and a butler always felt a bit extreme for a guy who pretty much lives alone. Webby is far from the harmless, sometimes annoying girly girl she was back in the 80s too. More notably, Huey, Dewey, and Louie now have distinct personalities. Back in the day, the 3 were kind of just one character sharing 3 bodies, the way triplets are usually handled in TV for some reason. Only triplets I know aren't like that, so I don't know where that comes from. See, Huey is the responsible older brother, and the only one who's still a junior woodchuck scout. He looks up to Scrooge for the many magical mysteries he's explored. Pursuit of knowledge, you see. Dewey is an explosive middle child who sees the daring adventures as a challenge to prove himself. Louie is the lazy youngest, who's not particularly suited for adventure at all, but who respects Scrooge for being a multi-trillionaire. He's in it for the money. Seeing the new triplets ironically makes the original show harder to watch because I like the brothers more when they're this distinct. Anyway, the show focuses on the triplets separately and evenly, by having each season primarily be about one of them each, with Dewey being the first leading duck. Both Teen Titans and Large Chunks of Ninjago did that too, and that format pretty much always works. I've yet to find a bad show with this format. Season 1 focuses mostly on Dewey, with Webby in a major supporting role. With everyone else moving in and whatnot, Dewey is set on uncovering the mystery of his mother, what happened to her, what Scrooge had to do with it, and why were Donald and Scrooge beefing in the first place. All the while, we get introduced to basic villains, both old and new. The last villain of the season being classic enemy Magica Dispel, in a final story which coincides with the Duck family reconciling over the issues Dewey ended up unearthing. It's a very compelling season-long mystery. Season 2 is Louis' season, which surprisingly wound up making him my favorite of the triplets. After a whole season of not being good at adventuring, Louis decided to find what he's good at and start a business, Louis Incorporated, which leads to shenanigans and, well, shenanigans. I say whatnot a lot in the script. Meanwhile, Scrooge finds himself in a bet with Flintheart Glomgold to make the most money. A winner gets the loser's company, and these stories intersect in a nice way. that I'm trying really hard not to spoil, because in the next few seconds I'm about to spoil something massive, which I can't really talk around because it's a discussion point. Sorry, you've been warned. The triplets' mother comes back. Again, for the sake of non-viewers, I won't spoil exactly what happens and what led to this, but yeah, Della Duck comes back, which makes for a very compelling side plot since she returns about halfway through the season. Her story is also the subject of the season finale, which I'll admit I don't like as much as the season 1 finale, even though I like season 2 a bit more. In season 1, Dewey's story went right up through the finale, where here, Louie's arc ends an episode before the finale, which makes the final episode feel less like the ending to the story we set out with and more like a victory lap. But there's nothing wrong with a victory lap, especially when everyone else is losers. So season 2 is pretty good. Our last season focuses on Huey, with an opening that straight up invalidates his previous status as best junior woodchuck, which I like because he swiftly finds a new way to prove himself as an explorer when he and his family find a notebook of lost treasures that were never found. Good enough framing device, but the Duck family finds themselves racing to find these treasures before they're taken by the organization Foul, made up of many villains from throughout the series, including a few surprising faces. Webby also gets a pretty big storyline this season, but I'll put that to the side for now because I expect I'll be talking about it later. Editing David from the future. I decided to respect your viewing experience and not talk about it because it's a finale twist. You owe me for this, David of the past, and viewers. Our finale culminates in a story which sees secrets revealed, character arcs end, and Huey absolutely comes into his own as an older brother and explorer, as one would expect. He was already great at both of those things. He's a good little munchkin. If I had any grievances, it'd be that finale mostly focuses on Webby, with Huey's stuff feeling more like a side story. I don't have a problem with Webby's story being the thing we end the series on. It's been going since episode 1, but it makes Huey feel like a side character in the ending to what should have been his own season. But I can't complain too much. There's literally no way they could have alleviated that without giving Webby her own season, and a hypothetical 4th season could have made or broken the show. Ducktales certainly doesn't overstay its welcome, and I applaud it for that, but Bun of a Stitch, I would have loved to see the season spread out a little bit more because the finale is cramped as is. So that's a basic summary of the series, some of my thoughts on the seasons, with some of the biggest things left out so you can enjoy the series itself, okay? Okay, that was the stuff you gotta know. Here's a bunch of ramblings about why it's good. First off, I've done a whole episode about serialized storytelling, and if you watch these in order, you've seen it already. All you need to know is that this show is really good at serialized storytelling, to the point where pretty much the only thing that springs to mind as being better example of that than this is Justice League Unlimited. We forget how big a compliment that is. The fact that the story of season 1 is still relevant all the way up to the end of season 3 is great. I've seen other wonderful shows struggle with that. There's not much I can go too in depth with, at least not without spoiling stuff outright, but seeing the show evolve as it goes is a major draw. Pretty much the only downside is that small chunks of the show were aired out of order, but they're in the intended order on Disney Plus, which is how most people are gonna watch this thing anyway. My monthly thank you to Globalized Media. Don't worry, my cursing of Globalized Media is actually weekly, so it balances out. There's this handy little exchange rate. Time and place. Each season is quite intricate in how they're plotted out and paced. Plus, the mystery writing is generally quite good. The mysteries the show sets up across all 3 seasons, such as the Della stuff or Fowl's antics, are very engaging, even with a complete lack of familiarity with the source material. It's also worth noting how much this pulls from, not just the original DuckTales show, but every comic and medium that Donald Duck has appeared in. Heck, even, wait, not spoiling, the thing that happened to Della in the first place was technically pulled from an existing source. So yeah, if you're familiar with this stuff to an obsessive degree, you can feasibly solve many of the mysteries in the show if you know where to look. But if you don't know where to look, well, just enjoy the mystery while it lasts. I don't know what to tell you. But let's talk about the intricacies of the main characters. Hate to lump the triplets all together, but it's worth noting they're among the best depiction of brothers in fiction. Up there with Gumball and Darwin in my eyes. Louie has to stand out as my favorite just for how he's written. He embodies a lot of archetypes you don't see fleshed out that much. Conversely, Dewey is a stellar main lead for that first season, and Huey manages to slip into the role so naturally that the transition is almost unbelievable. They needed to make each of these guys the leading ducks at different points, and all of them totally work. That extends to Webby too. It's an ensemble cast so good that literally any of them can be the main character at different times with no issue. Anyone who's written an ensemble can tell you how hard that is to pull off. On the other end of the spectrum, Scrooge is an incredibly layered character. David Tennant's performance performance does wonders for the guy. Scrooge is a little more standoffish than he was in the original show. He's a seasoned adventurer who's being forced into the role of mentor to the kids of the main cast. Not like they're children, them. Last Crash to the Sun Chaser, for reasons that will go unspoiled, is almost Futurama-esque in how it's executed, and it paints an incredibly interesting picture of Scrooge. I'll get into the villains in a bit, but Scrooge has a bespoke dynamic with every villain in the show, and it's great. He's ambivalent towards Glomgold. He doesn't really take Mark Beeks seriously at all. His dynamic with Goldie O'Gilt is just everything. The two of them have a Batman and Catwoman dynamic, but they're so overtly head over heels for each other that it's just heartwarming most of the time. I think some of the most interesting characters in the entire show are Donald and Della Duck themselves. For such a famous character, Donald's never been portrayed with any particular degree of depth. We often forget Donald wasn't in the original DuckTales nearly as much as you'd think. Like, would you believe the guy only showed up in less than 10 episodes of DuckTales 87? All in the first season? Not so here. He's the backbone of the show. They choose to make him the overly cautious and protective guardian of the triplets, a former adventurer like Scrooge, who's much more accident-prone, jaded, and quick to anger. All of that sounds like textbook Donald Duck, but the show manages to justify and expand upon those traits as it goes. Meanwhile, Della is the complete opposite case of Donald, in many ways. Yeah, she's shown up before this show, but she is far less of an established character. Even her name hasn't been entirely consistent over the years. So unlike Donald, the writers had basically nothing to go on when writing her character. So they went the route of making her Donald's opposite. Daring, adventurous, and because of the years she'd spent out of commission, not at all prepared to take care of the boys. But that's not gonna stop Della Duck. Nothing can stop Della Duck, I have been told. But as I said before, we get to the very interesting scenario of seeing Della attempting to parent her own kids for the first time. The degree of writing on display means Donald and Della are some of the most fun characters in the show. Yeah, the kids get the focus, but I'd argue that these two have an equally compelling sibling dynamic. And on their own, they're great characters with their own arcs and whatnot. I don't have much to say about them, but Beakley and Launchpad are also surprisingly well written, though admittedly most of the stuff that adds to Beakley's lore comes in the last season, but she's a great character through and through, while Launchpad is just funny, and if that's all you want her to be, that's fine. But then Launchpad goes on to be an unironically inspiring character. That level of care also goes into every side character, especially Gyro Gearloose, who's definitely the most substantial side character. But speaking of substantial side characters, the many fun and varied villains of the show, because there's a lot. Flintard Glomgold is straight up the funniest villain I think I've seen in a cartoon. Keith Ferguson, phenomenal voice actor, and one of the most ridiculously petty villains this side of Reverse Flash. Other standouts include Doofus Drake, who has been rather substantially reinvented to be a more malevolent character. The Beagle Boys and Ma Beagle, who went from copy and pasted doubles to a gang with substantial variety in their designs. Mark Beeks, one of the show's best new villains. Zeus, who is barely a villain, but the fact that they decided to make Zeus a mythologically accurate jerk makes me so happy. I'm surprised more shows don't do that. Plus a bunch of other villains I'm running out of time for. Probably the most interesting villain of the show would be their take on Magica De Spell and her relationship with her niece, Lena, who is a recurring character and friend of Webby. See, Magica was an existing character from the original show, but Lena is not. And with Magica receiving quite the power upgrade from show to show, that makes Magica something of a big deal. So the show spends a lot of time on Lena, and she's the most major original character of the show, and the result is, well, a genuine portrayal of familial abuse. It's okay, they're fictional ducks and it's magic, nothing you couldn't otherwise get on TV, but still, they get a lot of mileage out of this. Side note. That's a wonderful side note. Now an aside. Not only is the voice acting incredibly high grade, but the number of high profile voice actors they got is insane. I mentioned David Tennant already, but they also got Lin-Manuel Miranda to voice some nobody named Fenton, and also the totally unrelated Gizmo Duck. Chris Diamantopoulos, the voice of Mickey Mouse at the time, also does a lot of characters in the show. He's a great voice actor I've talked about before. Donald Duck has his usual voice actor, and occasionally Don Cheadle. Keith David shows up at one point, as does Kiri Hiroyuki Tagawa of all people. They got Shang Tsung for this, what? And Scrooge's dad would have been voiced by Alan Young, Scrooge's original voice actor, had circumstances allowed. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. Just assume everyone I don't mention by name is amazing. One of the other things that this reboot gets right is reverence for the source material, which is something we're seeing more of nowadays with revivals and such. But I think the big thing is that reverence extends to not just the original DuckTales cartoon, but every show that gets referenced. Not even shows, even the original comics that most of Donald Duck's extended cast come from. Gladstone Gander, Cousin Feathery, Simsbury, even Phantom Blot. Everything from character interactions to visual reference and even the occasional name, there's a level of respect for prior works that the show practically oozes. Even the unspoiled Della thing is making an old twist new again, but the point stands. There's a lot of love in this show for everything that gets referenced. Speaking of things this show references, well, it's a lot. Someone on this crew said, hey, we have the chance to reference pretty much all of the Disney afternoon lineup of programming. Which show should we mention or visually reference? Someone else in the room said, yummy. And nobody knew how to respond to that, so they just decided everything, reference everything. They managed to get so much into the show without necessarily being too overt. It's like its own miniature Disney afternoon revival. They've got classic Ducktales, of course, but there's also characters from Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers and Tailspin, plus Goof Troop and even Bonkers of all things. I caught visual references to Quack Pack, The Adventures of the Gummy Bears, Mickey Mouse, a slightly horrific take on the Wuzzles. I even caught music from Gargoyles at one point. It's not even just Disney afternoon shows, because there's this dude that looks like Dr. Doofenshmirtz from Phineas and Ferb. There's also a few things that might be references, like this character, Storkules, being a Hercules stand-in, could be a reference to Disney's Hercules if you squint. There's probably a Gravity Falls reference I didn't get. This scene might be a reference to Randy Cunningham, ninth grade ninja. I mean, they gave Dewey Randy's voice actor and made him say smoke bomb a lot, but if that's a reference, then Webby being voiced by Kate Micucci is a reference to Motor City. And if there's one thing I know about Disney, it's that they don't reference Motor City. It's a sad state of affairs we live in. But of course, there's the big one that they reference a lot, and it makes all the sense in the world to do so, Darkwing Duck. That just makes sense. Launchpad was the main cast member in both shows back in the day, so obviously, if any old series got to be the obvious favorite, it was Darkwing. So not only does Darkwing himself show up, not only do his villains show up, but we get a whole two-part episode in the final season dedicated to Darkwing Duck. Bit of a tangent, but I want to talk about this because they were pretty smart about this. Darkwing Duck is an in-universe show, which Launchpad is a fan of course, and we're introduced to it in season 1. In season 2, we get a whole episode where it turns out there's a film studio making a movie based on Darkwing, but they're not using the original actor, and it's being led by a director with the complete wrong priorities who demonstrates complete misunderstanding of and borderline contempt for the original source material. I won't say anything if you don't. That particular brand of scum doesn't need feeding today. But while Launchpad tries to stop the movie being made, with help from the OG Darkwing actor, it turns out the actor that got to play Darkwing in the reboot is a massive nerd who just wants to inspire a newer generation of fans. The parallels are mounting. But the new actor is actual Darkwing in the show going forward. It's a fun little twist on one of my favorite episodes of the show. As for Darkwing's other main villains, they mostly show up in the two-part special in season 3, Let's Get Dangerous. And most of them are villains from the show brought to life. This sadly means that we don't get the whole Fearsome Five since Negaduck isn't among them. I think they were saving him for a spinoff we never got. I actually wonder if that was a legal necessity since DC Comics owns the name Fearsome Five, but I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. I've seen every production mistake I've ever made, often making my own work unwatchable to me or anyone else. I stay awake at night. I fear what the Lord has planned for me in my mistakes. No, I am not insecure. Do you want to fight? Speaking of quality things I'd like to fight about, let's talk about the visuals of the show. I realize we're coming to an end, but I've got no idea where to put this otherwise. Smooth animation make my brain go burr, and now I can't words correctly. I know it might seem like a trivial thing to talk about, but when something's visual candy, I eat it up with my eyes. Ow! Here's what I mean. Compare something like The Motion in TMNT 2003, what with the blur to simulate speed, to how the same thing looks in Rise of the TMNT. Every frame is on screen and it's ridiculously smooth. And that's the exact same quality DuckTales has. Except rather than just being in action scenes, it's very often in facial expressions, even basic movements. The result is DuckTales being one of the most expressive cartoons of its era. Did they get James Baxter for this? I actually want to know. I'm gonna look this up after I film. Because if you told me they did, I'd believe you. My major point being, you don't often get shows that look like this, and the reason why is because of a little thing called funding. I feel like as creators, we don't often talk about the benefits of corporate backing, but if you want a demonstration, this show got a bunch of people who were good at their jobs and funneled their talents into their work, and that's the best case scenario for corporate backing, so good for them. Yeah, you can feasibly get this done without a money pit behind you, but I don't even want to think about those poor animators if you did. For less than $1 a day, you too can keep these poor souls from being poorer souls. Not sure how, but it's an option. You can do it. Oh my gosh, I managed to go this whole time without mentioning the self-evident fact that this show is incredibly funny. Better play a bunch of clips from the show to illustrate my point.
Pretty weird way to build a bridge.
Let go of my uncle!
No. The poor man's version of me. Which, to be fair, still makes him insanely rich.
And that's why you don't scream while sinking in quicksand.
Webby, please don't tell me how to die!
Dewey, honey, I don't think they built it with a big hole in it.
For real though, I aspire to have a sense of comedic timing like this. Either this or that of the Marx Brothers. Oh, look at that. I guess I'm out of time for this episode. Unless there's a bunch of things I could add last minute. Nope, I'm out of steam. Well, not really. Trust me when I say this episode could easily be twice the length it is now, and I already used up the 16 pages I afford my special presentations. Yeah, that's why I got the new name in the episode titles, by the way, if you haven't caught on, because these episodes are longer. But if I did go longer, I'd have to be a super duper presentation this time, and I'd have to spoil the entire show one episode at a time, and at that point, I'd rather y'all just watch the show yourselves. That sucks for me, because I really wanted to end this by talking about the show's finale, because I have a lot of thoughts on it, but it's a principle of mine not to spoil things I recommend, and this whole episode has been one long recommendation. Bottom line, 2017's Ducktales is a show that managed to defy expectations of cartoon reboots and came out the other side a really good show. Stellar animation, voice work, writing, great work all around. That was somewhat completely overshadowed by its contemporaries. You can find the whole thing on Disney+. If not, the first episode is straight up available online. 45 minutes, but worth the commitment. If you're really interested, give it a watch. There's a reason this thing is one of my favorite cartoons of all time, and I'm glad I got to talk way too much about it. Tune in to other episodes of Cartoon Gateway for more cartoon discussion, or maybe more little known facts about me, such as I once ended a friendship after a huge argument because a so-called friend of mine refused to believe that the Darkwing Duck theme song sounds ever so slightly seductive. I cannot be the only one who hears that.
Let's get dangerous.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.